So in this segment, we do want to talk about specifically the fourth wave of modern missions. We've talked in other classes about the fact that there were three waves of what we call the modern era, when God allowed missionaries to get onto boats and go to the coastlands of the world and the interiors of the world, and then eventually to kind of target and realize the world was made up of thousands of biblical nations, of ethnes that we need to specifically reach if we are going to preach the gospel to all nations and to all people. And I personally believe, in some ways, in the same way that when the Iron Curtain fell, we didn't really kind of see it coming, it just kind of happened. I also believe fairly recently, a fourth wave of modern missions has begun, kind of building on the first three that I actually had the privilege of being able to write the first book about. And it's called The Fourth Wave, Taking Your Place in the New Era of Missions. And I believe there's going to be a lot written on this in the coming years and definition to it, and it was just a privilege to begin to think about it and look at a few things and begin to put together some of the outlines of what is God doing, especially in the 21st century. And we're going to go over a number of things related to that. In this segment, I want to talk about two of them. So there are 8 different characteristics of the fourth wave of modern missions, and this is the first one. That in this fourth wave of modern thrust to complete the Great Commission and have everyone hear the wonderful news that Jesus loves them, they can be forgiven. Number one, all ages of people will be involved. All ages of people will be involved. And you might want to stick in your notes, tack on to that, and that's for the first time in history. For the very first time in all of history. In the fourth wave of modern missions, you can be a child, you can be a teenager, you can be an adult, you can be a man, you can be a woman, and you can be a senior. It doesn't matter what your age is. In the fourth wave of modern missions, and this has never been true before, you can be missional. You can be involved in missions. You can have a mission in life. We've mentioned in past segments that for really about 1,850 years, ever since Jesus died and rose from the dead until the 1850s, the world's missionaries were not only men, they were all adults. There was no such thing as youth missions or teenage missions or even elderly missions, maybe a little bit of that, but not much. People didn't live as long, actually, but for 1,850 years, the world's first missionaries were adult men. Then, in the 1850s, following the Civil War, we've mentioned that women were added to the cause, and not only added, wow, talk about being multiplied. Women are now larger than men in the numbers of missionaries serving globally. So you have 1,850 years of the men really doing the majority of the work, and then following the American Civil War, women getting involved, and in just 150 years' time now, women make up a larger bulk of global missionaries than any other segment. But the other thing that's been added, and specifically just in the last 50 years, has been you can be a child, meaning under the age of 12 or 10 or whatever. You can be a youth, and again, be involved in missions or live a missional life. And you can also be a senior citizen. I have a favorite senior citizen. I have a lot of favorite senior citizens, actually, but I think of one very fondly that helped me build my house, and his name was Roy. A man that just really wonderfully loved and knew God. Used his entire life just as a man and really didn't travel much around the world. He was an electrician, but he just always loved Jesus, and he was involved in his local community. But he also got a bit of a vision for a particular nation. It was a fairly nearby one. It was Mexico. And when Roy was 95 years old, he was wiring houses for poor people in Mexico. And that was, again, only in this time period. That couldn't have happened in many other time periods at all. Here's an elderly man who got involved in a mission team and went out, and at 95, he's still using his gifts in the missions realm. In our organization, we actually had a division called King's Kids for kind of a number of years, and that's when God was speaking about how young people could also get involved in missions, actually of all ages. And that's only really happened since the 1960s. So starting in the 1960s, and then after that, is when the idea of, hey, young people can share their faith too. And we're going to mention later about why that's true and how that happened. But at this point, we'll just keep to the fact that they were young. Again, prior to 1960, if you were a kid or if you were a youth, especially, non-adult youth, you really couldn't be involved too much in what we call world evangelization. But in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and beyond that, I think the number now stands at about 40 million young people have gone out on short-term trips and many other kinds of trips. I remember doing that with my own family. My wife and I have 6 children, and we're part of a ministry where I'll never forget, one of our kids, we traveled to the nation of Albania. And there, one of my kids who was just 4 years old was actually singing and performing the gospel, in essence, preaching the gospel as a 4-year-old. In my home church, I remember the day in which one of the young girls in the church, she actually was a daughter of the pastor. She was only 8 years old at the time. She encouraged her dad, hey, we got to get involved in China. We need to do some things for the people of China. And so she kind of stirred up her dad, who stirred up others, and a number of offerings were taken and teams were going at that time. And so this 8-year-old girl basically got a church involved in doing humanitarian aid and evangelism in the nation of China, actually to a specific group called the Li people. And interestingly enough, just this week, by the way, I got a report about the fact there's a revival taking place among the Li people on the island of Hainan. When this girl, the teens were going in the early days, there were very few Christians there. In fact, they only knew of one at the time. There now are thousands. And so again, God using all these things, even an 8-year-old or a 95-year-old. And again, that's totally unique to history. Basically, in all of the past, evangelism, world missions was limited to adults, but not today. You can be just a little one and be missional. You can be a teenager and be a part of just, thousands of youth teams that go around the world. You can be an adult in your middle ages. In our organization, actually, that's called Youth with a Mission, so that tends to mean we focus on youth, right? But actually, the largest segment of people joining our organization today, which is over 50 years old now, are people over 40. We still mobilize youth, but a whole bunch of people have raised their kids and kind of said to themselves, what do I do for the rest of my life after I retire? And they've come into our mission because as even older adults, they can serve in a missional way. And then because people are living longer, into their 70s, 80s, and 90s, or 100 or whatever, you can be involved for your entire lifetime in a variety of ways, from young to old. That was never possible before in any other era. So again, what a privilege to be alive during this day. So how do we personally apply this? I'm going to talk about a personal application of each of these. One of those would be, for those of us with children, is to train your kids to be missional minded. Get them involved. Go out with them. Do various things. And of course, get them involved reading missionary biographies. It's actually one of the biggest Christian markets today, of all kinds of books about the right kind of heroes, people who have gone out and helped touch the world. So train your kids, your grandkids, to think missionally. Think about what they can do to impact the world. Secondly, do encourage your children to take youth short-term trips. There's a bit of controversy in the world about the value of short-term missions. Sometimes people say that, well, is the money really worth it? And do we upset the people we're going to, or do we get in the way of the missionaries? And there are some concerns always related to those kind of things that I'm sure have some validity. But I believe every mission trip has meaning all by itself. It has meaning in the life of the person that changes. There are people that give their lives to Christ through those particular trips. And I'll throw out one other statistic to you. It's an interesting one. And that is, of all the people serving in global missions today, which we estimated about 250,000 serve in cross-cultural missions all over the world. Of that 250,000 people, 250,000 people, we estimate that those people are there serving as cross-cultural full-time missionaries because of one of two reasons. They were either the children of missionary parents who instilled their values in their kids, and so they stayed on the field or they went back to the field. Or they came overseas as a young person on a youth trip, saw God's burden for the world and for a particular nation, and they got so hooked when they got back and grew up and finished school and all that, they went back to the mission field. That 80% of all global missionaries are either MKs or products of mission trips. So there's a lot of reasons for the value of children, youth getting involved in short-term missions training. The direct benefit, the indirect, and just how God uses it in a variety of ways. We can also serve in missions in our later years, as I have mentioned. There's quite a number of organizations that actually do that. In our organization, we call people like that mission builders. And they've raised their kids, and they buy, fifth wheels, and they have their trailers and all that kind of stuff. And in the United States, they travel all over the place, and they serve missions. They go to mission bases, they serve projects, they do this, they do that. There's another group called the Sowers, does the same type of thing. Another international group is called the Mappers, who go around the globe, and it's kind of become a fellowship of older people. In our country, you see their trailers, going everywhere, but around the world, they're also hopping on planes. And so, again, you may not be able to do certain things in your early life because of God's plan or because of your family years, but who knows? It may be. I was just talking to a person today, actually, who's very excited about retiring at the end of this year, and he looked me in the eye and he said, I really want to use my life for missions. And I thought, yeah, you and millions of others that God is stirring right now. That's exactly what God is saying to people all over the world. So it can be done at any time period. And of course, another thing I would add here, it's on a practical level, how we can apply this aspect is people, again, of all ages adopting a child in another nation. That's a huge emphasis and a huge need today. I was again with a mission group today that talked about some of the orphanages of the world and the kids at risk, and there were some pictures shown about these beautiful African kids, of course Asians, and in our own country as well, everywhere. But even as a young child, let alone a teenager, I actually adopted my first child to support when I was about 16, I think. And so you can be involved internationally in that way of just, raising a little bit of money and paying for a child and do it as a family or do it as you grow up. It's a tremendous way to help with the needs of children around the world. The second interesting aspect of the fourth wave, and it's a fairly unique one that we'll mention in this section, is that all nationalities will be involved in the fourth wave of modern missions. All nationalities will be involved. And you can also stick in parentheses here again, for the first time in history. All nationalities will be involved in this global wave of missions. Now, we've talked about the fact that the initial early followers of Christ were Jews. Then we would call them Gentiles after the day of Pentecost, but they were certain kind of Gentiles. They were Gentiles from really around the Mediterranean. They were part of the Roman Empire, the Roman-speaking world. And then eventually missionaries became Europeans during the Middle Ages as the gospel spread primarily to this region of the world. Then after Europeans, missionaries became Americans. And for the last 100 years or so, the largest missionary force in the world has been Americans. And then as the thrust continued, we have many islanders that are involved in missions today, but because the gospel has gone global, especially in the last 200 years, that brings us to the fourth wave where, again, for the first time in history, every single nationality on earth, we believe, is being mobilized right now by God to be part of the Great Commission. Now, that may not strike you as, maybe too wonderful or too exciting, but it really should. But just think about the fact that if you lived here for the last 1950 years, or you lived here for the last almost 2,000 years, and if you lived in most of this, in all the major parts of the world, especially Latin America, Africa, and Asia, if you lived in those nations for most of the last 2,000 years, you couldn't be a missionary. Now think about that. That's stunning all by itself. The fact that it's taken this long for the gospel truly to go global. First of all, just starting with the Jewish people, the first ethnic group, then Roman citizens, Europeans, Americans. But in the last 50 years or so, and especially in the last 30 years, the gospel has just exploded in these other portions of the world where, as we mentioned now today, for example, 100 years ago, 70% of the church lived in Europe. 70%. They were in Europe, but they were also above the equator. Northern Hemisphere. As the church then expanded into the Americas in the 18th century, 19th century, the church still remained primarily in the Northern Hemisphere, the northern latitudes. But again, this also kind of snuck up on us. Just 30 years ago, we kind of discovered God had been doing some things below the equator. Today, there are more people that are Christians below the equator than above. And it just almost happened out of nowhere. So, not nowhere, but in God's amazing and wonderful plan. And I like to kind of term this change, kind of picture in your mind Latin Americans. I have a lot of Latin American friends, I have a lot of African friends, Asian friends. I basically term it this way, and this is not meant to be a racist comment. The fourth wave is basically this: the brown-skinned friends of Jesus are coming to a city near you. That's really what's happening in the world today. The whole face of missions is changing. And I could illustrate this from just a standpoint of my own mission. I serve in a mission that's technically the second largest mission organization in the world. Okay? When I first got involved, which was 40 years ago, there were about 300 of us full-time. And how do I know that? We had a staff conference. They were all there because we could get 300 people together. But today, and in that staff conference, I don't know exactly what the breakage was, but probably at least 98% of our staff they looked like me. They were white. Now fast forward 40 years of our organization continuing to go into all the world, and today there's about 25,000 of us full-time. And millions that have been mobilized on a short time basis. So in 40 years, from 300 to 25,000, and today the majority of us are brown skinned. And that's, again, been just an incredibly amazing change. For example, South Korea over here. Where's Korea? Yeah, there. The Korean Peninsula, right here. South Korea was one of the poorest nations in the world 60 years ago, utterly broken and devastated by World War II and then the Korean War. But today, South Korea has become the second largest sending nation in the world. In this area in which we live, there's 250 Korean churches. And you can go almost anywhere around the globe today. Some of the biggest churches in the world, the biggest church in the world is in Seoul, Korea. It's called Yoido Full Gospel Assembly. And you walk into that church and there are 12 services on Sunday at about 20,000 a service. And so that's a lot of people, but that's 150,000 or whatever, but that church numbers 800,000 people in their small groups. And again, how God's been moving in Korea and using them. The second largest missionary nation in the world today, which wasn't even on the map 100 years ago, no missionaries 100 years ago, is the nation of Brazil. When we were working in Albania, in this one trip I was telling you about, we were going to go up into a village and we were told, you're going to be the first missionaries these people are going to see. And then we found out there was already a Brazilian team that had planted a church there. That was exciting, but again, very interesting. So Brazil is now number 2 in the world. Nigeria is also number 9 in the top 10. And one of the biggest things God is using around the world through Latinos and Africans and Asians, for example, I was doing some reading today about India and some of the northern areas of India, Nagaland up in this area. I know of an individual who's planted 5,000 churches through what we call indigenous church planting movements. It's where kind of whole villages and areas come to Christ as a result of key people getting saved and planting, churches that are not Western churches. They're totally Indian churches or African churches. And that's just what's happening in this fourth wave, what we would call indigenous church planting movements. There's so many stories I could tell about this, but I think you're kind of getting the picture. The missionary used to kind of be this Protestant European, and he was Caucasian. But in the fourth wave, really, a baton is being passed, really, from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, from the whites to those of a different color skin, and they are picking up that baton. And I believe the further we go in the 21st century, it's not a matter of us stopping. I mean, God doesn't care about skin color. It's just a wonderful thing that now, for the first time, everybody in all the nations, and of course it's necessary because we want to reach billions. And for those billions to be reached, naturally the Lord would want all of South America to be involved, and Africa to be involved, and Asian cultures to be involved. I have a friend who kind of typifies this. His name is Larry Centeno. Larry was a Puerto Rican basketball player. I met him, became a disciple, and I eventually drew him out into Asia where, because of his basketball skill, for 2 years he actually coached a professional basketball team in Mongolia for me, kind of under my auspices. They almost won a national championship actually, but it was just kind of a front for sharing Jesus, with the sports population and kids in Mongolia. Larry then eventually moved on to the Philippines, and so he was in the nation of Mongolia. And Mongolia is right here in the green here. He then met his wife down in the Philippines, down here, and they got married. So here's a Puerto Rican who speaks Spanish, marries a girl who's Filipina, and she speaks Tagalog. They get married. Their marriage language is English, the common language. That's the one they speak, of course. And they actually have ended up, they go back and forth to Mongolia, but they've actually ended up settling in the Philippines. Larry's a church planter there. He's the face of missions. Both brown skinned, both from nations that never were ever a part of this in past centuries. But today they've sold everything, they've raised support, they now have 2 or 3 kids on the way, they're planting churches, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing. So what can we do to kind of be involved in this fact that for the first time in history, all nationalities can get involved? I just want to mention a couple practical applications of this. Even where we are, it's important to reach out to other nationalities in our community. Now, some of us live in places where they're more international, but even in my hometown, there are groupings of Filipinos, Guamanians, Guatemalans, and others, and especially if we live in urban settings and cities and so forth. In many ways, God is bringing the world to us in many places. And so we need to think kind of outside the box. How can we reach out to other nationalities that are in our country? A second thing is a kind of a prayer point. One of the most important things we can do to see the gospel spread in the 21st century is for one nation to become free. And it's this nation right here, China, the biggest nation in the world. And we don't know how many believers are there, but we've mentioned that the greatest single revival in the history of a nation has probably taken place in China in the last 50 years. When there were about 3 million Christians, when basically Mao Zedong came to power, and they tried to crush the church, and Time magazine said on the cover, God is dead in China. Well, that was a little bit premature because God doesn't die. And within the last 50 years, that 3 million has exploded to, most of us think, around 100 to 120 million. And the Chinese have a tremendous vision for going across Central Asia, bringing the gospel back to Jerusalem. In fact, they have started a movement that's called the Back to Jerusalem movement, where they pray for all the different stans that are here, and Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, of course, they're praying for those nations. They're beginning to send out people, but why is that difficult? They're a communist country. Only certain people from communist countries can travel, usually the elite or the sons of and daughters of those who make a lot of money. The common person in China is not free. They can't leave the country. They're held there. One of the greatest prayers we can pray in the 21st century is for China to become free. Just like the Soviet bloc opened up. Can you imagine what the Chinese really want to do? One of their stated goals is, if we become free and we can all travel, we want to tithe our people to world evangelization. So just do the math in your head. If there's about 100 million Christians in China right now, and China becomes free like Eastern Europe did at a point in time, then that would add 10 million people. 10 million people. Talk about the brown-skinned friends of Jesus coming everywhere. I think you'd find Chinese restaurants on every corner practically. I mean, they want to go across Central Asia, but of course they want to go global, just like everybody else does. So just China becoming free would just utterly change the missions equation in ways we can hardly even begin to imagine. The other thing I would mention is China at 1.3 billion people, joining forces with India at 1.2 billion people, So 2.5 billion of the 7 billion people in the world live in these two nations. I believe God wants them to form a strategic partnership for world evangelization. If any baton is being handed from the United States, it's being stuck in a Chinese hand and an Indian hand. And those brown-skinned people are really the future of missions, and the future is actually right now, for them to partner together. Along this line of thinking through and learning about the nations of the world, I cannot recommend to you a book more important than this one. They used to say about missionaries that to be a missionary you had to have a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other, meaning you got to know what's going on, and you got to know God's Word and share it with people. I believe in today's world, yeah, you need a newspaper too, so maybe you need three hands, I don't know, but you need the Bible in one hand and you need Operation World in the other. And this is on the web as well, it's on CD, it's not just a book, but Operation World to me is the best book ever written on the world overall from a Christian standpoint. And I've used it for a number of years to actually kind of make it my second Bible. There's actually a program in it where you can actually read on a different nation every day and read about the unreached peoples that are there and read about what God's doing and what are the problems, and there is no book like it. I used it for a number of years just to acquaint myself with the world. And I realized I didn't know hardly anything about the world. I didn't even know some of the names of the nations. I certainly didn't know the provinces of China. I didn't know the names of the Tibetan people or Nepal, or I didn't even know that Irian Jaya existed. Or Djibouti, where was Djibouti? I realized how ignorant I was of this wonderful world that God had made. And so I actually began just kind of studying this, kind of using it as a devotional, just to kind of go through a few pages a day and just learn about every single nation and about every single people group and all the various things that are there. And I actually think that's one of the best things you can do to kind of up your vision to the fact that God does want all these nationalities and for you to know their names, to be involved in world evangelization. A final thing you can do in this area is to get involved in supporting what we call a majority world missionary. From our branding in the Western world, we talk about other people of the world being third worlders, We're first worlders and Europe is second worlders. And what are third worlders? Well, those are all the so-called poor people in all the other countries. Well, that's not God's view of things. And what we've learned as missionaries over the years, it's not first, second, and third, it's minority and majority. The majority of people live in a whole bunch of other nations. You can start right here, but everywhere else. So I would encourage you to think about, even if you can't go or you can't go now, how about getting involved with supporting, like I do with my friend Larry Centeno or other people in other countries. Why don't you support a majority world missionary as a huge and wonderful part of being a part of the fourth wave?